I would like to tell you the story today of a life that began in this exact spot where now stands Bobby's Restaurant. A life, a well-traveled life, a life that didn't necessarily go the way that the person thought that it would. Long before Bobby's Restaurant stood here, now known for its decadent cinnamon rolls, there stood a very nondescript tenement building where in 1862 a man was born, Samuel Gabot. Samuel's parents moved across the St. Lawrence Seaway to Odenburg, New York, shortly after Samuel was born because there was more economic opportunities over there and better schools. And they decided that Samuel could have a better life on the New York side. Samuel basically grew up in Odenburg, but when he was old enough to be out on his own, he longed to leave the area and start a business for himself. He wanted to be his own boss. He left Odenburg and went to Minnesota, but was only there a short time. But while he was there, he met a gentleman named Henry Frank. Henry Frank was a mining speculator who wanted to start his own mine in the wilds of Alberta. And he needed a right-hand man, someone he could trust. And he set his sights on young Samuel and talked him into coming with him to the wilds of Alberta, Canada. With the flip of a coin, young Samuel and Henry Frank decided on the name Frank, Alberta. And they began building their new town at the base of Turtle Mountain. Here is a picture of the very first buildings. They were going to mine coal for the Canadian Pacific Railway, and they secured a contract with them that they would buy all of the coal that they could mine. Turtle Mountain was particularly blessed with coal, and it didn't take them very long at all to begin finding veins of coal running throughout the mountain. The town of Frank was incorporated on the 3rd of September 1901, and the grand opening was on the 10th. It was an all-day event including sporting competitions, tours of the mine, a huge banquet, and a dance. 2 special trains brought dignitaries and guests and gourmet food, including a ton of ice cream. By January of 1903, the town served 1,000 people with 24 businesses and services, a 2-story brick school, and a beautiful brand new post office. But tragedy struck. On the 29th of April, 1903, a slide destroyed much of the town. The town was built too close to Turtle Mountain, and mining activities had caused the mountain to become very unstable. The Native Americans in the area had warned the settlers not to build their towns so close to the base of the mountain because they told them that at night the mountain walked, but they didn't listen. So when a small tremor occurred on the 29th of April, 1903, it destroyed much of the mine's infrastructure, several businesses, 7 houses, and killed around 90 people. The mine reopened weeks later, and within a month or two, the railroad had replaced the tracks that were wiped out by the sliding mountain, and the town resumed growing. By 1906, a new residential subdivision had been developed to the north of the town, and a new zinc smelter was built to smelt the recently discovered cache of zinc, and a brand new 3-story hotel was built, and it also had a small zoo. In 1911, the Canadian government came in and said the mountain was too unstable, and they wanted them to once again begin moving the town. It was also about this time that the Canadian railways began converting their trains from burning coal to burning oil, and that was the final nail in the coffin for Frank, Alberta. Henry Frank had died in 1908, and he had left the remnants of the mine and the remnants of the town and all of the headaches to Samuel Gabeau, who just wanted out. He wanted to start fresh in the wilds of Wyoming. He wanted to start his own mine without all of the baggage and without all of the death and destruction that he had endured in Frank. Samuel had found a buyer, and he sold out lock, stock, and barrel and went to the wilds of Wyoming and founded his own town, the town of Gabeau, Wyoming. And his new company would be called the Owl Creek Coal Company. Things were going good in Gabeau. As a matter of fact, they were going a little bit too good. The miners had already founded their own band, and the community had built their schools and hospital, and things were going great guns. As a matter of fact, they were going a little bit too good, and the government began to investigate the paperwork that he had filed for the right to mine the coal in the area, and they discovered discrepancies in the paperwork. All the work that had been done in the town was all for naught, because in 1912 the federal government brought criminal, civil, and administrative proceedings against Samuel Gabeau, all of the investors in the Owl Creek Coal Company, and all of the entrymen, the people that had invested in the company. By late in 1912, it became apparent that the government would be successful in closing all of the mines. The Miners' Union president A.H. Peterson wrote the judge in charge of the proceedings, Honorable Francis E. Warren, in Washington, D.C., a letter, and it said, "Dear Sir, I have the honor of writing to you tonight, being authorized by the local union 2671 of the United Mine Workers of America to do so. We are very much concerned as a body of men over our work. No doubt you will think it strange that we write to you over this matter, but I will try to explain, and I have no fears but what you can do to help us. We are mining coal for the Owl Creek Coal Company of Gabeau, Wyoming, and I understand that you are having some trouble with the government in getting patents. In fact, from what we hear, they cannot get them on account of making their first filings illegally. I have no doubt but such is the case, but it is not for us to say. All we have to say is we are glad to work for them and would like to see them get their patents or a lease or something that would allow us to continue work. We understand Secretary Fisher is about to make a decision on their filings and have heard it said that they will lose out. In this event, it is us, the miners, who will suffer most. For if he decides against them and they shut down, we will be thrown out of employment in the dead of winter. We are several hundred people depending entirely upon the mine for a living, and most of them are men of families. It will be a serious thing if the mine shuts down, for the work has been very poor for several months and we are barely making a living now. but we don't know where to go because other places are worse, and besides, we have not enough money to move anyway. Now, we do not want the government to condone any kind of a fraud for our sakes. In fact, we are glad to see them take the stand that they are in regards to some who have been violating the nation's laws. But we feel some leniency could be shown. If they cannot get a title to the land, could they not get a lease? Or if neither of these, could we please prevail upon the Secretary Fisher to postpone the decision for a few months until the weather is warmer and we are in a better condition to move? It would be useless for us to write him, for it would have no weight, but he would listen to you and no doubt consider our conditions. I do not desire to weary you, but trust you will intercede for us, and you will have the best wishes of an entire community, hoping you will do so. Your best friend, wishing you success. I am yours respectfully, A.H. Peterson. Secretary of the Interior Fisher did listen to the Honorable Judge Warren. Congress passed a resolution authorizing the mining property to be leased by the coal company. It was a win-win for the coal company and the government. The government received a royalty check for each ton of coal mined. The company stayed in business and the employees returned to work. But it was all very short-lived because the papers that had been filed initially for the patents for the land that they were mining was completely fraudulent. And the papers that Gabot had filed for the sale of the mine in Frank, Alberta, had numerous falsehoods in them, and the government decided that they were going to go after Gabot for both of those things. When Gabot had first came to Wyoming, one of the first things he did was he had bought 300 acres to build his own mansion because he had a desire to raise Belgian horses. That was one of the dreams that he had always had. Belgian horses are incredibly strong draft animals that can haul extremely heavy loads and can endure very cold weather, and it is exactly what Samuel Cabot wanted to do, was be the premier breeder and supplier of Belgian draft horses in the Midwest. So in order to fulfill his lifelong dream of raising Belgian horses, as soon as he bought the 300 acres to build his mansion, he first built a barn. And because he owned the local company that produced concrete, he built the barn out of solid concrete. And when it was finished, he had a ceremony and invited 300 people. And they set up an immense celebration in the loft of the barn. There was 300 people having a huge banquet dinner, and there was a 30-piece orchestra playing music, and everyone danced. It was an amazing time. At the party, several of his government friends told him that the government had decided that they were going to arrest him and charge him with crimes involving all of his fraudulent papers that he had filed. And it was his absolute fear, more than anything else on the entire planet, that he would end up in jail. And rightfully so, his fears were well-founded, because the Wyoming Penitentiary was particularly known for being an awful place to be. So, in the middle of the night, he disappeared and went to Guatemala, where he took what little cash he had and opened a small quarry mining limestone for local buildings. The government came in, took his land with the barn on it, took over operations of the mine, and basically forgot all about him. But he stayed in Guatemala until he was sure that the statute of limitations had ran out, and he didn't come back to the United States until 1927. In 1927, he reemerged in Seattle, Washington, after he had left Guatemala and sold the limestone quarry and took the little bit of money that he got and came back to America. His first wife had divorced him when he had left in the middle of the night, and he was now married to a woman named Leona that he had met in Guatemala. These were very bad times. He was in ill health, and his wife from Guatemala, I believe, thought that she was coming to the promised land, and instead she found herself living in a tenement building in a rundown section of Seattle. And he wasn't happy, and she wasn't happy, and it was not a particularly good time. But she stayed with him, and they lived in Seattle until 1940, when broke, destitute, out of money, living in a tenement building, living hand to mouth, he had enough. He turned the gas tap on, sat in his chair until the room filled with gas, and lit a match, and committed suicide, and took out most of the tenement building that he was living in. He had been at one time the wealthiest man in Wyoming, and he had traveled with the well-heeled and was friends of people in government, and had made and lost several fortunes in his lifetime, and now he was going to be buried in a pauper's grave in Seattle, Washington. For a legacy, Samuel Gabot was leaving behind 2 ghost towns, 2 communities that were wrecked, and the people who lived there, their lives ruined. In 1920, the town of Gabot, Wyoming, had suffered the ravages of the Spanish flu epidemic. It was very hard on newborn babies and the very old. After the mines closed and the people left, how hard it must have been to leave your children and your mothers and your fathers and your grandparents behind. Little remains of any of the processing plants in Gabot. Leona died the same year that Samuel did. After he died, she was left behind in Seattle, Washington, living in tenements that she hated. In a small cemetery in Seattle, Washington, stands a forgotten headstone. Sunset in the remnants of a ghost town far out in the Wyoming wilderness. Remember, everyone, be good to each other, do good deeds, think good thoughts, and I will see you on the next adventure.